Alrighty, this is chapter 20, section 2, Europeans settle North America. Now, the main idea is several European nations fought for control of North America, and England emerged victorious. Now, why does this matter today? The English settlers in North America left a legacy of law and government that guides the United States today. Alright, some terms and names we're going to go over. King Philip, Puritans, Pilgrims, Jamestown, New France, New Netherland, and the French and Indian War. And like we discussed in our previous lesson, looks like the purple lines are the voyages of Christopher Columbus, and the green lines are the voyages of the French. And above that, actually, were Viking expeditions. The Vikings were the first Europeans into North America, and they came from Greenland, but this isn't widely known. Alright, so competing claims for North America. Spain's successful colonization efforts in the Americas did not go unnoticed, but other European nations such as England, France, and the Netherlands soon became interested in obtaining their own valuable colonies. So like we discussed in our previous lesson, Spain was making a lot of money over in North America. It was not known as, and South America, it wasn't known as America like it is today back then. So other countries like England and France were like, hey, you guys are making all this money. We want a piece of the pie too. All right, the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, divided the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal, and lands to the west of an imaginary line belonged to Spain, and lands to the east of this belonged to Portugal. And that's this line going all the way down, right in the middle of the ocean right there. So everything west was going to be claimed by Spain, and everything east of that was going to be claimed by Portugal, which includes only Brazil, pretty much just Brazil. The plan proved to be impossible to enforce, and other European countries ignored the treaty, and they sent out to build their own empires in the America, and this resulted in a struggle for North America. Alright, so Magellan's voyage showed that the ships could reach Asia by the Pacific Ocean. And if you remember in our previous lesson, we talked about Magellan as he circumnavigated the entire world. Well, he didn't. His crew kind of did. He got killed in the Philippines. Spain claimed the route around the southern tip of South America, which is down here. And other European countries hoped to find an easier, more direct route in the Pacific. Now, Spain probably set up a bunch of ships and stuff there. So if any other ships or any other country besides Spain would go down there, they'd sink the ship. So other European nations do not want to go that route. They're going to want to look for a northwest route, which is above North America. If it existed, the northwest trade route through North America to Asia would become highly profitable. Not finding the route, the French, English, and the Dutch instead established colonies in North America. So they never found a route because it was all ice back then. Now you could probably find it with all that ice melted, but back then, nope. This was all ice. Alright, explorers established New France. The early French explorers sailed west with dreams of reaching the East Indies. One explorer, named Giovanni de Vezanero, an Italian, in the service of France. And in 1524, he sailed to North America in search of a sea route to the Pacific. While he did not find this route, he did discover what today is New York Harbor. 10 years later, the Frenchman Jacques Cartier reached the Gulf of the eastern coast of Canada. That led to a broad river, and Carter named this the St. Lawrence River. He followed it inward until he reached a large island dominated by a mountain, and he named this island Mount Real, which later became known as Montreal. And in 1608, another French explorer, his name was Samuel de Champlain. He sailed up the St. Lawrence River with about 32 colonists and founded Quebec, which became the base of the French colonial empire in North America, known as New France. All right, explorers established New France. Then the French penetrated the North America continent, and in 1673, a Judas priest named Jacques Marquette, and he was a trader. Um, Trader Louis Joliet explored the Great Lakes too, and the Upper Mississippi River. So these are a couple other explorers that are going to be exploring and also promoting some Christian values because they were priests to the Native Americans who didn't want to be converted in the first place. All right, so nearly 10 years later, after that expedition, here we go. We got another Frenchman. Sir de la Salle explored the lower Mississippi. He claimed the entire river for France and he named it Louisiana in honor of the French king, Louis XIV, who was a baller. He, he had a lot of huge parties and he drove France completely in debt from all of his spending, but we will get into that later. By the early 1700s, New France covered much of what is now the Midwestern United States and Eastern Canada. A trading empire. France's North American empire was immense, and it was sparsely populated. And by 1760, the European population of New France had grown to only about 65,000 people. Now, a large number of French colonists had no desire to build towns or raise families, and these settlers included Catholic priests who sought to convert Native Americans. They also included young single men um, engaged in what became as New France's main economy, and that's going to be the fur trade. That's when you kill an animal, you take its fur and you sell it, the fur trade. Unlike the English, the French were less interested in occupying land. When they were making money, they weren't making money off the land, they were making money off the fur, so they didn't really care about occupying the land. They just want to get in there and take the animals. All right, the English arrive in North America. The explorations of the Spanish and the French inspired the English, and in 1606 a company of London investors received from King James a charter to found a colony in North America. Now, we're not talking about LeBron James here. This is King James of England, 1606. And in the late 1606, a company of 3 ships and more than 100 settlers pushed out of an English harbor. And about 4 months later, in 1607, they reached the coast of Virginia. And the colonists claimed the land as theirs, and they named the settlement Jamestown in honor of their king, King James. The settlement at Jamestown, the colony's start was disastrous. The settlers were more interested in finding gold and planting crops. Big mistake. During which few years, 7 out of every 10 people died of hunger, disease, and battles with the Native Americans. And despite the nightmarish start, the colonists eventually gained a foothold in the new land. Jamestown became England's first permanent settlement in North America, and the colony's outlook improved greatly after farmers there discovered tobacco. High demand in England for tobacco turned into a profitable cash crop. A cash crop means something that you grow and then you sell it. And if you ever heard of the story of Pocahontas, this is where it happened, at Jamestown. The Disney movie Pocahontas. All right, let's talk about the Puritans. The Puritans create New England, and in 1620, a group known as the Pilgrims founded a second English colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, if you ever heard of Boston, Boston is in Massachusetts. Persecuted for their religious beliefs in England, these colonists sought religious freedom. So these guys were getting tracked down back in England. They were getting prosecuted for being Puritans, so they were like, screw this, we're going to leave England and we're going to start our own thing up in the New World in North America, and they're going to create Plymouth. All right, so 10 years later, a group known as the Puritans also sought religious freedom from England's Anglican Church, and they established a larger colony at a nearby Massachusetts Bay. Now, the Puritans wanted to build a model community that would set the example for other Christians to follow, and although the colony experienced early difficulties, it gradually took hold, and this was due in large part to the numerous of families in the colonies. So, unlike the single male population down in Jamestown, these guys brought their families over, and it was going to be a lot more successful of a colony. All right, the Dutch found New Netherland, also known as New York now, following the English and the French into North America were the Dutch. And in 1609, Henry Hudson, an Englishman in the service of the Netherlands, sailed west. If you ever traveled from New Jersey over to New York, you probably crossed the Hudson River. Okay, so he was, and it was named after that guy. He was searching for the Northwest Sea route in Asia. Hudson did not find the route. Once again, they're not going to find the route because it was covered in ice, at least back then. You might be able to find a route today. He did, but you can just fly now, so you don't need a ship to get you from point A to point B. However, he did explore three waterways what were named after him: the Hudson River, which is next to New York, the Hudson Bay, and the Hudson Strait. All right, the Dutch claimed the region along these waterways. They established a fur trade, killing animals and selling it to um, Native Americans, who were the Iroquois. They built trading posts along the Hudson River at Fort Orange, which is now Albany, and Manhattan Island. That's where you see all those big skyscrapers in New York. Dutch merchants formed the Dutch West India Company. And in 1621, the Dutch government granted the company permission to colonize the region and expand the fur trade, and the Dutch holdings in North America became known as New Netherland. And although the Dutch company profited from its fur trade, it was slow to attract Dutch colonists. To encourage settlers, the colony opened its doors to a variety of people, and gradually more Dutch, as well as Germans, French, and Scandinavians and other Europeans settled in the area. All right, colonizing the Caribbean. And during the 1600s, the nations of Europe also colonized the Caribbean. Now, the French seized control of present day Haiti, Guadeloupe, and the English settled in Barbados and Jamaica. That's probably why Jamaicans still speak English today. And in 1634, the Dutch captured what are now known as the Netherlands, Antilles, and Aruba from Spain, and all these islands. The Europeans built huge cotton sugar plantations. This is why this is important. And these products demanded a large, steady supply of labor. And who was going to supply that labor? It was going to be African slaves would supply this labor. All right, so if we look at this map here, this is just gradually showing what year it is and how this area started to change over time. Um, as the years go on, Spain is red and France is blue and Great Britain is gold, and you can see the changing of the colors, meaning the changing of the territories. I think eventually Great Britain here, takes control of everything. All right, pirates. Can't forget about pirates. Patrolling the high sea were pirates, and they attacked ships for their valuables, and they didn't care what nation the vessel represented. So these guys kind of just represented themselves. And one of the best known pirates was a man named Edward B. Teach, who's who he earned the nickname of Blackbeard. If you ever heard of Blackbeard, his name was actually Edward Teach. So in 1717, Blackbeard captured a French merchant vessel and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. And I believe Queen Anne was the queen. I think she could have been the Queen of England. I don't think she was the Queen of France. She might have been the Queen of France. But anyway, he named it the Queen Anne's Revenge. That ship actually was sunk off the coast of North Carolina. But Blackbeard attempted to frighten his victims by sticking lighted matches underneath of his hat, which appeared on both sides of his face and eyes. So this dude would light his face on fire. And on November 22nd, 1718, Blackbeard was cornered by two British ships. Now, this was off the coast of North Carolina. And the battle ended in a hand-to-hand fighting combat on the deck of a ship. When Blackbeard was finally killed, they found about 5 bullet wounds and 20 sword cuts in his body. This guy was a beast. And that's why he lives up, to the reputation to being one of the most fearsome pirates in history. Some might argue it was Francis Drake, but we might get into him later on. All right, the struggle of North America as they expanded settlements. The nations of France, England, and Netherlands battled each other for colonial supremacy. Supremacy meaning, domination. Who's going to take control? And here we are in New Jersey. And this is New York. This is New York City right here. This is us in New Jersey. All right, the English oust the Dutch. All right, the English. To the English, New Netherlands separated the northern colony and southern colonies. And in 1664, the English King Charles II granted his brother, the Duke of York, permission. The Duke of York. Listen to that name, the Duke of York. Permission to drive out the Dutch, and the Duke's fleet arrived in New Netherlands, and the Dutch surrendered without even firing a shot. Right when the English landed, they were like, yo, we're going to take over this, so you can go ahead and leave. The Duke of York claimed the colony for England and renamed New Netherlands to his present-day name, New York. That's where New York gets its name from the Duke of York, who kind of just took over that colony. They took it from the Dutch. With the Dutch gone, the English colonized the Atlantic coast of North America, and by 1750, about 1.2 million English settlers lived in 13 colonies from Maine to Georgia. Now, Maine is up here, Georgia's all the way down here, and I wouldn't say we're in the middle, but we're kind of right up in the northern region of that in New Jersey. All right, North America in 1750. Check out North America in 1750. So we have the yellow is British, the red is French, and the green is Spain. Now, if you remember in our previous lesson, 100 years before this, Spain was conquering all this land down here, but they never really reached up here. Spain never reached up here. It was the English and the French. But we speak English for a reason today, ladies and gentlemen, because of this. All right, England battles France. The English soon became hungry for more land for their colonial population, so they pushed further west into the continent, and by doing so, they collided with French's North America holdings. Not a good idea. As the colonies expanded, the French and England began to interfere with each other, and it seemed that a majority of this conflict, it seemed like there was a conflict on the horizon. So the British were going to start pushing west and west and west, and they're going to bump into the French, and the French are like, yo, this is our territory, get out of here. So in 1754, a dispute over land claims on the Ohio River Valley led the Ohio Valley, led to a war between the British and the French on the North America continent. Now, this was going to be the first war fought in America, but it wasn't known as America back then. It was still known as the New World. And like I said, the conflict became known as the French and Indian War, and the war became part of a larger conflict known as the Seven Years' War. Britain and France, along with other European allies, battled for supremacy in Europe, the West Indies, and India. So that I think the 7 Years' War was the first global war. So you can consider the 7 Years' War World War One. Who knows? But no, it's not World War One. But it was a global war. All right. So in North America, the British colonists, with the help of the British Army, defeated the French in 1763, and the French surrendered their North American holdings. And as a result of the war, the British seized control of the eastern half of North America. All right, 1763, the Treaty of Paris. So, what happened here? France lost their Canadian possessions after the British won the war. Um, so, maybe it was a good thing that the British were pushing west because they ended up getting more territory. It was good for them, but a lot of people died. All right, so French lost their Canadian possessions, most of their empire in India, and claims to lands east of the Mississippi River. And Spain got all of French lands west of the Mississippi River. New Orleans, but lost Florida and England got all of the French lands in Canada, exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade, and commercial dominance in India. So this is the map, and you can go ahead and check out the areas, which obviously Great Britain took over. The red's going to be the 13 colonies. Um, France was pretty much kicked out of North America after this. Russia's got a little bit of claims up here in Alaska, but it's going to be dominated by the Spanish and the English, also known as the British. All right, so what are the Native Americans going to do during this? What are they going to say about this? I'll tell you what they're going to say. Native Americans respond, and as in Mexico and South America, the arrival of the Europeans in the present day United States had a great impact on Native Americans. European colonization brought mostly disaster for the lands of the original inhabitants. The French and Dutch settlers developed mostly a cooperative relationship with the Native Americans through the fur trade. Native Americans did most of the trapping and then traded the furs to the French for such items such as guns, hatchets, and mirrors. And the Dutch also cooperated with the Native Americans as an effort to establish a fur trade enterprise. However, the groups did not live together in complete harmony. The Dutch settlers fought with the various Native American groups over land claims and trading rights. And for the most part, the French and Dutch colonists lived together peacefully with their North American hosts. So the French didn't really, overall, the French and the Dutch lived together pretty peacefully. The same cannot be said with the English. The early relationships between the English settlers and Native Americans um, were cooperative. However, they quickly worsened over the issue of land and religion. Unlike the French and Dutch, the English sought to populate their colonies in North America. This meant pushing the Native Americans off their land, and the English colonists seized more land for their population and to grow tobacco. And Native Americans don't, at least back then, that they didn't see that land belonged to anybody. They thought that land belonged to everybody. And the English were like, no, 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 this is our land. We're going to put a fence up. We're going to put this up. We're going to put a house here. This is ours. Religious differences also heightened tension. The English settlers considered Native Americans heathens, meaning people without faith. And over time, many Puritans viewed Native Americans as agents of the devil and as a threat to their godly society. Native Americans developed a similar harsh view of the European invaders. So you're going to have some conflict with these guys. It's not going to be good. The hostility between the English settlers and the Native Americans led to warfare, and as early as 1622, the Powhatan tribe attacked the colonial villages around Jamestown and killed about 350 settlers. And during the next few years, the colonists struck back and massacred hundreds of Powhatans. So you can see this European shooting this Native American right in the chest. All right, one of the bloodiest conflicts between the colonists and the Native Americans was known as the King Philip's War, and it began in 1675 when the Native American ruler, Metacom, also known as King Philip, not to be confused with the European ruler, led an attack on the colonial villages throughout Massachusetts. And in the months that followed, both sides massacred hundreds of victims. And after a year of fierce fighting, the colonists defeated the natives. And during the 17th century, many skirmishes erupted throughout North America. Now, more destructive than the Europeans' weapons were their diseases. And like the Spanish and Central Americans, the Europeans who settled in North America brought with them several diseases. No good, not good, not good, not good. So this is going to repeat itself. The diseases devastated the native population in North America. And in 1616, for example, a epidemic of smallpox ravaged the North Americans living along the New England coasts. And the population of one tribe up in Massachusetts dropped from 24,000 to 750 by 1631. That's some drastic numbers. And these guys did not have built-up immunity to these diseases. There was no vaccines, obviously, so they were dying by the thousands. So like our current situation with COVID-19, we don't have natural immunity, or we do not have a vaccine for that. So that's why it's so dangerous, and you have to take these precautions. But 400, 500 years ago, it was way worse. So from South Carolina to Missouri, nearly whole tribes fell victims to smallpox, measles, and other diseases that the Europeans brought over. And now the Europeans, for centuries, those guys were going to have immunity to that. They were exposed to those diseases. So they just naturally had those antibodies. And when they came over to North America, who met these new people, if you would, were never exposed to those types of sicknesses. So they were going to die by thousands. All right, almost done here. Slave labor. We're getting into slave labor, which is going to carry on to our next section. Slave labor, one of the most effective losses was the severe shortage of labor in the colonies. So that was one of the biggest issues in the colonies. They didn't have a lot of people to work the lands. So in order to meet the growing labor needs, because there was so much work that needed to be done in the fields, European colonists soon turned to another group, and they were going to go to Africa, who they would steal from their native land, enslave them by the millions, put them in ships, and sail them across the ocean and make them work in the fields in North America. So this is everything we talked about in 1754. This is what this map is to the left in 1754. In less than 10 years, you can see the change here. The English didn't have too much holdings in North America, and then by 1763, they pretty much dominated. All right, so that's your lesson for today. Thanks for listening. Peace out.